My son had that same tattoo.
6. Hardened Hell's Angels, paralyzed by 4 simple words from a frail, 80-year-old waitress. Blood ran cold under their heavy leather cuts. What she recognized wasn't just ink, it was a ghost from a buried past, a bloody secret about to tear their entire brotherhood violently apart. The Nevada sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Highway 95 like a hammer on an anvil. Heat waves shimmered off the desolate stretch of road, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Out of that mirage came the thunder. It started as a low, guttural rumble, a vibration that shook the dry sagebrush and rattled the windows of the few abandoned gas stations dotting the barren landscape. Within minutes, the rumble swelled into a deafening roar as 6 heavy, customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles tore through the desert wind. They rode in a tight, disciplined stagger formation, a heavy cavalry of chrome, steel, and black leather. These were no weekend riders. The heavy denim, the soot-stained boots, and the unmistakable 3-piece patches on their backs announced their arrival long before they killed their engines. The top rocker arched proudly, "Hell's Angels." The bottom rocker anchored their territory, California. And in the center, the iconic winged death's head grinned fiercely at anyone foolish enough to ride their tail. Leading the pack was Dutch. At 45, he was a massive oak of a man, his face weathered like old saddle leather, from decades of riding into the wind. As the president of a notorious offshoot Oakland charter, Dutch commanded absolute authority. To his right rode Rooster, the sergeant-at-arms, a wire-thin, volatile man with cold, calculating eyes and a jagged scar running from his ear down into his collar. Behind them rode Clay, Wyatt, Silas, and Kip, 4 heavily tattooed, battle-hardened enforcers who lived and breathed the outlaw code of the 1%er. They had been riding for 12 straight hours, escaping the suffocating pressure of a brewing turf war back in the Bay Area. They needed asphalt, open air, and a place to drop off the grid. As the small, dusty mining town of Tonopah rose from the dirt, Dutch threw up a leather-gloved hand, signaling the pack to slow down. He pointed a heavy boot toward a faded neon sign buzzing weakly against the harsh daylight. Rusty's Diner, home-style cooking. The 6 bikers downshifted in unison, their V-twins popping and snarling as they pulled into the gravel lot. They backed their bikes into a neat row, killing the ignitions one by one. The sudden silence that fell over the lot was heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling exhaust pipes and the crunch of gravel under heavy boots. Inside Rusty's Diner, the lunchtime rush had long passed. The air conditioner rattled fiercely in the window, struggling to push a weak breeze through the room, which smelled heavily of old frying oil, stale black coffee, and pine sol. A couple of local ranchers sat in a corner booth, nursing cold beers, while a lone trucker hunched over a plate of greasy eggs at the counter. When the heavy glass door swung open, the diner went dead silent. The ranchers stopped talking. The trucker kept his eyes glued to his eggs, suddenly finding them incredibly fascinating. Even the rattle of the air conditioner seemed to dial back. Dutch led the way, his heavy boots echoing on the scuffed linoleum. He didn't swagger, he just moved with the terrifying, unhurried confidence of an apex predator. The men claimed a large, red vinyl booth near the back. Sliding in, their leather cuts squeaking against the upholstery. Dutch unzipped his vest, shrugging off the heavy leather to cool down, revealing thick, heavily muscled arms entirely covered in dense, intricate tattoos. Skulls, flames, club mottos, and years of hard living mapped his skin. He ran a hand through his sweat-dampened graying hair and sighed, the exhaustion of the road finally settling into his bones. Behind the counter, standing by a silver coffee urn, was Ruth. Ruth was 78 years old, a frail wisp of a woman with a hunched back and hands that trembled slightly with age. Her gray hair was pinned up in a messy bun, and she wore a faded pink waitress uniform that had probably been bright in the 1980s. She had owned and operated Rusty's Diner for 40 years. She had seen drifters, outlaws, fugitives, and lawmen pass through her doors. She was not easily intimidated. She wiped her hands on a heavily stained apron, picked up a fresh pot of steaming coffee, and grabbed a stack of thick porcelain mugs. "Keep your eyes down, Kip," Rooster muttered across the table, his hand resting casually near his heavy leather belt. Place is full of locals. We just want food, no noise. I ain't looking at nobody, Kip shot back, rubbing his sore neck. Just want a steak and a beer. Ruth shuffled over to their table, her orthopedic shoes squeaking faintly. She didn't flinch at the sight of the death's heads, nor did she shy away from the menacing glare Rooster shot her. Afternoon, boys, Ruth said, her voice raspy but surprisingly steady, like dry leaves scraping across pavement. You look like you brought half the Mojave Desert in here with you. Coffee? Dutch looked up, a faint, respectful smirk touching the corner of his mouth. Outlaws or not, there was an old-school respect for the elderly ingrained in the club. Yes, ma'am. Black. All around. And whatever your biggest steaks are, burn 'em on the grill and bring 'em out. 6 burned steaks, coming up, Ruth nodded, moving around the table to distribute the mugs. Where you boys riding in from? Patches say California. Oakland, Silas grunted, crossing his massive arms. Long way from home. Oakland, Ruth murmured, a strange, distant shadow passing over her wrinkled face. She paused for a fraction of a second, her hands hovering over the table, before she continued pouring. I knew a boy from Oakland once. Long time ago. The bikers didn't pay her much mind. People always had stories about bikers they once knew. Dutch leaned back, stretching his arms out across the table, rolling his shoulders to pop his stiff joints. As he did, his right forearm turned upward, exposing the pale skin of his inner arm to the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner. Ruth moved to Dutch's side of the booth to pour his coffee. As she leaned in, her eyes fell upon Dutch's exposed inner forearm. Right below the elbow, surrounded by a sea of faded green and black ink, sat a very specific, deeply scarred tattoo. It wasn't the standard club insignia. It was a weeping skull, its eyes bound tightly by a crown of barbed wire, with a dagger thrust upward through the jawbone. But what made it truly unique were the small, jagged letters inked into the blade of the dagger. A, F, F, A, and below the skull, a cracked hourglass with red sand. It was a custom piece. An oath. Suddenly, the heavy glass coffee pot slipped from Ruth's trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the table and shattered against the linoleum floor. Boiling black coffee splashed across the boots of the men and splattered the booth. The explosive crash echoed through the quiet diner like a gunshot. Instantly, the table erupted. Rooster leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward, his right hand flashing instinctively beneath his leather cut, gripping the cold steel of a heavy combat knife. Silas and Kip pushed back, swearing loudly as the boiling liquid burned through their denim. "What the hell, lady?" Kip barked, shaking his leg. "Easy! Stand down!" Dutch ordered, his voice a booming baritone that immediately commanded the room. He shot Rooster a furious look, silently ordering him to put the weapon away. "She's an old woman." It was an accident, but Ruth wasn't looking at the broken glass. She wasn't looking at the furious bikers. She didn't even seem to register the boiling coffee soaking into her cheap pink uniform. Her pale, watery eyes were locked dead onto Dutch's right forearm. All the color had completely drained from her face. She looked as though she had just seen a corpse rise from the grave. Dutch frowned, wiping the spilled coffee off his arm with a napkin. He noticed her staring. Instinctively, he pulled his arm back, twisting it so the tattoo rolled out of her line of sight. It was a reflex. That tattoo wasn't for civilian eyes. "Sorry about the mess, ma'am," Dutch said, trying to diffuse the tension. "We'll pay for the pot." Ruth slowly raised her head, meeting Dutch's hardened gaze. Her lower lip trembled. "My son," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the air conditioner. "My son had that same tattoo." For 2 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then, a chilling, profound silence descended upon the booth. It was an unnatural quiet, heavy with an instant, suffocating tension. Rooster slowly lowered himself back into his seat, the anger vanishing from his face, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed stare. Clay stopped wiping his boots. Silas froze, his jaw clamped tight. Kip and Wyatt exchanged a rapid, panicked look. Dutch didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his massive frame suddenly looking rigid as stone. The air in the diner seemed to turn to ice. They froze because what she just said was physically impossible. That specific tattoo, the weeping skull, the barbed wire, the red hourglass, was not a flash piece picked off a parlor wall. It wasn't even a standard club patch. It was a blood oath. In the winter of 1998, deep in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 6 men of the Oakland Charter had been surrounded by a heavily armed rival syndicate. They were trapped in a cabin for 3 days, out of ammo, bleeding, waiting to die. They swore an oath that night. If any of them made it out alive, they would bear a specific mark to bind their souls together, in life and in death. 6 men took that oath. 6 men survived the siege. 6 men got the tattoo. And over the next 20 years, 5 of those men had died violent, brutal deaths. Dutch had buried every single one of them. He was the last living man on the face of the earth with that ink. If this frail, 80-year-old woman in a dusty Nevada diner was telling the truth, if her son had that exact tattoo, she could only be talking about one of 5 dead men. Dutch swallowed hard, his throat suddenly feeling like sandpaper. He reached out and gently, but firmly, grabbed Ruth's frail wrist before she could bend down to clean up the glass. "Look at me," Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous warmth. It was a dangerous, quiet tone. "What did you just say?" "Let her go, Dutch," Rooster warned quietly, his eyes darting around the diner. The locals were beginning to stare. "Shut up," Dutch hissed, never taking his eyes off the old woman. "Tell me exactly what you just said, ma'am." Ruth didn't pull her arm away. She looked down at his grip, then back up into his eyes. The weeping skull, the wire blindfold, the red hourglass. My son had it on his chest, right over his heart. Wyatt cursed under his breath. Silas leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. The details were perfect. She knew the red sand. No one outside the 6 of them knew about the red sand. "What was your son's name?" Dutch asked, his voice shaking almost imperceptibly. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her jaw set with a sudden, fierce pride. "Arthur. Arthur Pendleton. Though I know you boys called him something else." The name hit the 6 bikers like a physical blow. Rooster actually turned pale, staggering back slightly against the booth. Clay put his head in his hands. Arthur Pendleton. In the criminal underworld of the West Coast, he was known simply as Cross. He was a legend within the Hells Angels. Cross was the man who had single-handedly broken the siege in '98. Cross was the enforcer who feared nothing. And, to Dutch, Cross had been a brother, a mentor, and his best friend. But Cross was also the greatest traitor the Oakland Charter had ever known. 10 years ago, a massive federal raid had decimated their ranks. Millions of dollars vanished from the club's hidden lockboxes, and a crucial ledger detailing their weapons shipments had ended up on an ATF agent's desk. All the evidence pointed to one man, Cross. He had vanished the night before the raid, taking the money and leaving his brothers to rot. The club had voted on it, a unanimous decree of death. Dutch was the one who had hunted him down. Dutch was the one who found him hiding in a cheap motel in Tijuana. And Dutch was the one who supposedly put a bullet in his back and burned the motel to the ground, forever cementing his own rise to power within the club. "Arthur's dead, lady," Rooster growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "He burned to death a decade ago." Ruth let out a dry, bitter laugh that sounded like snapping twigs. She forcefully yanked her wrist out of Dutch's slackened grip. "Burned?" she spat, the sorrow in her eyes morphing into a burning maternal fury. "Is that the lie they told you? Is that the lie you tell yourselves to sleep at night?" She pointed a shaking, bony finger right at Dutch's face. "My boy didn't burn in any motel. He bled to death in my arms. 3 years ago, right in the back room of this very diner." Dutch felt the air leave his lungs. "That's impossible," he whispered, staring at the old woman in absolute horror. I saw him die." "You saw what he wanted you to see," Ruth countered sharply, leaning over the shattered glass. "Arthur knew you were coming for him. He knew the club put a hit on him. But what you fools never realized was why he took that money, and why he took the blame for that federal raid." Ruth stood up straight, brushing the coffee off her apron, suddenly looking 10 feet tall to the men staring up at her. "You sit right there. Don't you dare move." She turned and marched behind the diner counter, disappearing through a pair of swinging wooden doors that led to the back office. The 6 Hells Angels sat in complete, paralyzed silence. Rooster looked at Dutch, terror in his eyes. "Dutch," Rooster whispered frantically. "Dutch, if Cross survived, Tijuana. If he's been alive this whole time, then whose body did we burn? And what the hell is she talking about?" Dutch stared at the shattered coffee pot on the floor, the dark liquid seeping into the cracks of the old linoleum. His mind was racing, memories colliding violently with reality. He remembered the dark motel room. He remembered the gunshot. He remembered the flames. But most of all, he remembered how easy it had been. Almost too easy for a man as skilled and dangerous as Cross. "I don't know," Dutch finally answered, his voice hollow. He looked at the swinging doors of the kitchen. "But I think we're about to find out." The rhythmic, rattling hum of the diner's air conditioner felt deafening in the heavy silence. None of the 6 men at the table dared to speak. Outside, the harsh Nevada wind howled, kicking sand against the dusty windows, but inside, the world had shrunk down to the scuffed linoleum floor and the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen. Dutch stared at the shattered glass and the pooling coffee, his mind a violently churning vortex of denial and terrifying realization. "Arthur is dead," he told himself, the thought repeating like a desperate mantra. "I tracked him. I pulled the trigger. I watched the flames." But the absolute certainty in the old woman's voice, the precision of her knowledge regarding the red sand in the hourglass tattoo, was a cold hand gripping his spine. The wooden doors squeaked open. Ruth emerged, her frail frame weighed down by a heavy, fire-blackened steel lockbox. She moved with agonizing slowness, her orthopedic shoes scraping against the floorboards. But her gaze was locked on Dutch, with the piercing intensity of a hanging judge. She reached the table and dropped the metal box right in the center, ignoring the spilled coffee. The heavy thud made Kip flinch. "Arthur told me the day would come," Ruth said, her voice stripped of its previous frailty, now ringing with an ironclad certainty. "He told me that sooner or later, the ghosts of Oakland would ride through Tonopah. He said if I ever saw the winged death's head, I was to keep my mouth shut. But if I ever saw the weeping skull," she pointed a trembling finger at Dutch's forearm, "I was to give him this." Ruth reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small rusted brass key, and tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the wood, stopping inches from Dutch's heavy hands. "Open it," she commanded. Rooster leaned over, his eyes wide and panicked. "Dutch, don't touch that. This is a setup. The old bat is out of her mind. Cross burned in Tijuana." Dutch ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the rusted key. His heavily tattooed hand reached out, moving with a strange mechanical slowness. He picked up the key, inserted it into the lockbox, and turned. The lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic clack. Dutch threw the lid back. Inside the box rested 2 items. The first was a thick, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and stained with dark, rust-colored spots that looked horrifyingly like dried blood. The second item was a heavy, silver Zippo lighter, deeply engraved with a weeping skull and a dagger. Dutch's breath hitched in his throat. It was Arthur's lighter. The same lighter Cross had used to light his cigarettes during the 3-day siege in the Santa Cruz Mountains. With a shaking hand, Dutch reached past the lighter and picked up the leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with Arthur's unmistakable, cramped handwriting. But it wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous, detailed accounting record. Dates, names, offshore account numbers, and lists of federal evidence locker inventory codes. It was the missing ledger. The very ledger that had sparked the federal raid 10 years ago. Tucked neatly inside the front cover was a folded piece of yellow legal paper. Dutch pulled it out, his heavy fingers struggling to unfold the brittle paper. He flattened it against the table. The letter was dated August 14th, 2016, 3 days before the raid that tore their Oakland charter apart. Dutch began to read, his eyes scanning the faded blue ink. "Dutch, if you are reading this, it means my mother found you, and it means I am already dead. I know you came looking for me in Tijuana. I know you think you killed me. I needed you to think that. The man you shot in that motel room was a cartel hitman sent to put a bullet in my brain before I could disappear. I took his teeth, put my rings on his fingers, and left him for you to find. I knew you'd burn the place down. You always were thorough. Forgive me for that, brother." A cold sweat broke out across Dutch's forehead. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "What does it say, boss?" Silas asked, his voice a low, nervous rumble. Dutch didn't answer. He just kept reading, his eyes widening with every horrifying sentence. "I didn't take the club's money, Dutch, and I didn't sell our brothers to the ATF. 3 weeks before the raid, I found this ledger hidden in the ceiling tiles of the clubhouse. Someone was skimming from our lockboxes for years, padding their own pockets and feeding our shipping routes to the feds in exchange for immunity. They were setting us up for a slaughter." Dutch felt the air leave his lungs. He gripped the edges of the letter so tightly, the paper threatened to tear. "I knew if I brought the ledger to the table, it would tear the charter apart. We would have slaughtered each other in paranoia. So, I took the fall. I emptied the lockboxes myself and buried the cash in a trust for the wives and kids of the brothers who were about to get locked up. Then, I took the ledger and I ran. I became the traitor so the club could survive the raid united in hating me." "Dutch, talk to us!" Wyatt pleaded, leaning over the table, his eyes darting from the letter to Dutch's pale face. "What the hell is going on?" Dutch slowly looked up, his eyes lifting from the yellow paper to meet the gazes of the men sitting around him, his brotherhood, the men he had bled with, fought with, and killed for. But his gaze didn't linger on Silas, or Wyatt, or Kip, or Clay. His eyes locked dead onto Rooster. Rooster, the sergeant-at-arms, the man who had organized the club's finances for the last 12 years. The man who had so eagerly demanded that Cross be hunted down and killed. Dutch looked back down at the final paragraph of the letter. "The man who betrayed us is sitting at your table, Dutch. He sold our brothers to the feds, and he hired the cartel to silence me in Tijuana. Look at page 42 of the ledger. The offshore accounts are in his sister's maiden name. The rat who broke our club is Rooster." The diner was agonizingly silent, save for the furious, ragged breathing of the president of the Oakland Charter. Dutch sat perfectly still, the yellow letter trembling in his massive hands. "Dutch?" Rooster asked, his voice suddenly sounding terribly thin. He forced a strained, awkward chuckle. "Come on, man. Whatever that dead piece of paper says, it's garbage. Cross was a liar. He was a rat. We all know what he did." Dutch slowly, deliberately folded the letter. He placed it back inside the leather notebook and closed the cover. He didn't look at Rooster. He looked at Ruth. "How did he die?" Dutch asked, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "Lung cancer," Ruth replied softly, her anger giving way to a profound, lingering grief. 3 years ago, he coughed until his heart gave out in the back room of this diner. He spent his last days looking out that window, watching the highway, terrified that the men he loved were going to ride in and finish the job. Dutch closed his eyes. The weight of a 10-year lie crashed down upon his shoulders, threatening to snap his spine. He had hunted his best friend. He had celebrated his death. And for a decade, he had ridden side by side with the man who had orchestrated the entire tragedy. Dutch opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. He reached out and grabbed the leather ledger, flipping it open to page 42. He slid it across the table, right in front of Rooster. "Cayman Islands routing numbers," Dutch said, his voice dropping into a terrifying, gravelly register, registered to a shell corporation under the name Evelyn Shaw. "That's your sister's maiden name, Rooster." Rooster stared down at the ledger, all the blood instantly draining from his face. His jagged scar stood out starkly white against his pale skin. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Dutch, I swear to God." "You swear to God?" Dutch interrupted, his voice rising, vibrating with a lethal, barely contained fury. "You set him up. You sold our shipping routes to the ATF. You emptied the vaults into your sister's accounts, and you let Cross take the blame. You let me hunt my own brother." The revelation hit the table like a grenade. Silas physically recoiled, staring at Rooster as if the sergeant-at-arms had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. Kip and Wyatt exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Clay, the youngest and most volatile of the enforcers, let out a low, dangerous growl. In the outlaw biker world, there was no sin greater than being a rat. It was a stain that could only be washed out with blood. "It's a forgery!" Rooster shouted, his panic spiking. He slapped the ledger away. "Cross forged it to get back at me. He was a manipulative bastard, Dutch. You know that. You pulled the trigger on him because you knew what he was." "He didn't forge the ATF raid, Rooster," Dutch growled, leaning across the table, his massive shoulders blocking out the harsh desert light from the window. "He didn't forge the fact that half our charter did 10 years in a federal penitentiary while you rode around on a brand new custom bagger, preaching about brotherhood." Rooster looked around the table. He saw the cold, murderous stares of his supposed brothers. Silas had already uncrossed his arms, his right hand slowly slipping beneath his leather cut. Clay was practically vibrating with rage. Rooster realized, with a sickening jolt of pure terror, that he was surrounded by ghosts. He was a dead man breathing. Survival instinct took over. With a sudden, violent motion, Rooster kicked the table upward. The heavy wood flipped, sending porcelain mugs, the lockbox, and the ledger crashing to the floor in a chaotic explosion of noise. Before the table even hit the ground, Rooster's hand flashed to his belt. He drew a heavy, matte black 1911 pistol, aiming it directly at Dutch's chest. "Nobody move!" Rooster screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, the gun shaking wildly in his grip. He backed away from the booth, moving toward the diner's exit. "Hands on the table! All of you! I'll put a hole in the first man who twitches!" The local ranchers in the corner booth dove under their table. The lone trucker scrambled off his stool, taking cover behind the counter. Ruth stood perfectly still, her chin held high, utterly unfazed by the weapon pointed at her diner. Dutch didn't flinch. He sat amidst the wreckage of the spilled coffee and broken porcelain, his eyes locked onto the black barrel of the pistol. He didn't look afraid. He looked profoundly tired. "Put the gun down, Richard," Dutch said quietly, using Rooster's real name, a final severing of their brotherhood. "Shut up!" Rooster backed toward the heavy glass door, his eyes darting frantically between the 5 massive bikers. "I did what I had to do. Cross was weak. The club was bleeding money. I secured my future. You think I was going to rot in a federal cell for you animals?" "You broke the oath," Silas rumbled, his deep voice cutting through the panic. "Screw the oath," Rooster spat, reaching blindly behind him to push open the diner door. The bell chimed innocently. "I'm riding out of here. Anyone follows me, I start dropping bodies. You hear me, Dutch?" Dutch slowly stood up. He was unarmed, his massive frame a clear, easy target. "You're not riding anywhere, Rooster," Dutch said, his voice cold and flat as a tombstone. Rooster sneered, cocking the hammer of the 1911. "Watch me, boss." He took one step backward through the doorway, out into the blinding Nevada heat. But as Rooster backed out, his boot caught on the heavy wooden doorframe. Distracted by his panic and the blinding glare of the desert sun, he stumbled. It was a momentary lapse, a fraction of a second, where the heavy pistol dipped downward. It was all the time the wolves needed. Clay moved with terrifying, explosive speed. He lunged over the overturned table, tackling Rooster through the doorway. The 2 men crashed onto the hot gravel of the parking lot in a tangle of heavy leather and swinging fists. The gun went off. A deafening crack echoed off the metal siding of the diner. A spiderweb of cracks instantly bloomed across the large front window, spraying safety glass over the floor. Dutch, Silas, Wyatt, and Kip rushed out the door. In the blinding sunlight of the parking lot, the dust was settling. Clay was kneeling on the gravel, gasping for breath, clutching his left shoulder where a dark, wet stain was rapidly spreading across his denim shirt. Beneath him lay Rooster. The traitor's eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the merciless Nevada sun. The heavy combat knife that Rooster had been so eager to draw earlier was now buried deep in his chest. In the chaotic scramble, Clay had drawn his own blade, ending the 10-year betrayal in a matter of seconds. The wind howled through the desert, whipping sand against the chrome of the 6 parked motorcycles. The thunder of the engines was gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. Dutch walked slowly over to Rooster's lifeless body. He looked down at the man who had sold their souls for a comfortable retirement. He felt no triumph, No righteous vengeance, only a hollow, crushing ache in his chest. Dutch knelt in the gravel. With a heavy, calloused hand, he gripped the top rocker of Rooster's leather, cut the patch that read, "Hell's Angels." With a violent, tearing sound, Dutch ripped the patch entirely off the bloody leather, permanently excommunicating the traitor from the Brotherhood. He stood up, the bloody patch clutched in his fist, and turned to look back at the diner. Ruth was standing in the doorway, the harsh light illuminating the deep lines of her face. She looked at the body in the gravel, then looked up at Dutch. She gave a slow, solemn nod. The ghost of Arthur Pendleton had finally been laid to rest. The sharp tang of cordite hung heavy in the stifling desert air, mingling with the scent of hot asphalt and spilled blood. Silas and Kip moved silently, hauling Rooster's lifeless body toward the heavy saddlebags of his own custom bagger. In the outlaw world, the police were never called to settle family business. Traitors were buried in the deep Mojave, erased from existence without a headstone or a memory. Dutch walked over to Clay, who was sitting on the curb, his jaw clenched in agony. Wyatt was already tearing open a first aid kit, packing the gunshot wound with heavy gauze. "Through and through, boss," Wyatt reported, his hands slick with crimson. "Missed the bone. He'll ride." Dutch placed a heavy hand on Clay's uninjured shoulder, his grip firm and anchoring. "You did good, brother. You excised a cancer." Leaving his men to bind the wound and secure the traitor's corpse, Dutch turned his back on the blinding sun and walked back into the shattered diner. The terrified local ranchers had fled out the back emergency exit. The trucker was gone. The only sound was the crunch of broken safety glass under Dutch's heavy boots. Ruth was standing behind the counter, staring at the empty space where the booth table had been violently overturned. Dutch walked up to the counter and reached deep into his leather cut. He pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills club funds meant for a war that was built on a lie. He set the heavy stack of cash down next to the silver coffee urn. "For the window, ma'am," Dutch said, his voice stripped of all its former gravelly menace, leaving only a profound, hollow exhaustion. "For the mess, and for the decade of hell we put you through." Ruth looked at the money, then up at the massive, battle-scarred biker. Her pale eyes were soft now, the fierce, maternal rage having burned itself out. "Arthur didn't hate you, Dutch," she said quietly, her voice trembling like a dry leaf. "He hated the poison that was killing his club. He took the blame because he loved you boys too much to watch you tear each other to pieces." Dutch felt a hard lump form in his throat. He reached down to his right hand and slowly twisted a massive, heavy silver ring off his index finger. It was a winged death's head with ruby eyes. Cross had given it to him the night they survived the Santa Cruz Mountain siege 20 years ago. Dutch placed the silver ring gently on top of the stack of bills. "He was the best of us," Dutch whispered, his voice cracking. "We didn't deserve him." "No," Ruth agreed softly, her wrinkled hand reaching out to cover the silver ring. "But he gave his life to save yours anyway. Don't let it be for nothing. Ride back to Oakland. Fix your house." Dutch nodded slowly. He picked up the heavy, fire-blackened lockbox containing the ledger. This small, blood-stained notebook was the key to overturning the federal convictions of his imprisoned brothers. It was the undeniable proof of their innocence and Rooster's ultimate betrayal. Dutch turned and walked out the shattered front door, stepping back into the merciless heat. "Mount up," Dutch ordered. The command was met with the simultaneous, deafening roar of 5 heavy V-twins roaring to life. Silas threw a tarp over the rear of Rooster's bike, securing the traitor's body. Kip took the handlebars of the dead man's bagger, preparing to ghost-ride it into the barren wasteland. Dutch swung his leg over his Harley. He didn't look back at the diner. He didn't need to. The ghost of Arthur Pendleton was no longer haunting him. It was riding right beside him. Dutch kicked his bike into gear, popped the clutch, and led his battered, bleeding pack out of the gravel lot. They hit Highway 95, accelerating hard, disappearing into the shimmering heat waves of the Nevada desert, chasing the horizon to finally bring the truth back home. Did this unbelievable tale of betrayal, brotherhood, and a mother's relentless pursuit of the truth leave you breathless. If you were gripped by the explosive twist of Arthur's fate, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life dramas. Drop a comment below, would you have forgiven the traitor? Ring the notification bell so you never miss a ride.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, old woman said my son had that same tattoo. 6 bikers froze when they realized what it meant. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the mix of tension, mystery, and unexpected emotion behind something as simple as a tattoo. Sometimes people carry pieces of their past without realizing how deeply those symbols connect to other lives and memories. I think that's what made this story feel so personal underneath the biker atmosphere and tough exterior. Do you think the bikers were more shocked by the tattoo itself or by the memory attached to it? And have you ever had a small detail suddenly bring back emotions or connections you thought were long gone? Stories like this remind us that everyone has a history, and sometimes taking a moment to really listen to someone can change the entire way we see them. If this story pulled you in or gave you something to think about, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with mystery, loyalty, and emotional twists, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.